Once you have your machine out of the tray, I want you to look at how the cover is on here. Now these covers have gotten torn up over time, but you'll look at the front of the machine, in front of the handle, there is a rectangle. This is a wide rectangle. Behind the handle, there is a smaller, more narrow rectangle. So you want to make sure every time that you put your machine away that you always put the cover on correctly. So the large rectangle at the front of the machine, here's the front, it's got the numbers and the dials and everything. And then on the back, it's gonna have the smaller, narrower rectangle. When you take your cover off to start out the class period, you will slide it off the top of the machine, and then on your chair, right back here, you will lay the cover just like that. Oops, okay. Just like that. And that's how you will store the cover every day. All right, so just a few features of the Baby Lock. First of all, we've got our power cord and our foot pedal cord. This is the power cord, the black one. This is the foot pedal, and this is the on-off switch for the power. I'm gonna make sure that my machine is turned off right now, so the line is extended out and the O is pushed in. So that means the power is turned off. I'm gonna reach down here and I'm gonna grab my power cord. So it's the plug right here. You'll want to plug it in to one of the outlets underneath your table. If you are using a Chromebook and it needs charged and your machine needs plugged in, then you can get a power strip so that you can still plug in underneath your table in the outlet down there. But then you would plug your machine and your Chromebook into the power strip instead of into the floor, okay? So once that is plugged in, then we also need to adjust the location of the machine. So you want your machine at a comfortable distance from the edge of the table. This is centered right in front of me, and it's gonna be about 6 or 8 inches away from the edge of the table. At times I might pull it and get it closer to me, but I'm very rarely gonna have it all the way to the back of the table, okay? Then I wanna make sure that my foot pedal is aligned. So down here, the foot pedal is going to be, the fatter or the wider part is gonna be towards the, towards like the opposite end, and the narrower part is gonna be closer to you. There are times people like to turn those around, but this is the correct way to do it. So as I push myself in here, I've got my knees, and then right in front of my right foot is where my foot pedal will go, okay? So my machine's centered right in front of me, not on the edge of the table, there's a little room in front, and my foot is on the foot pedal right in front of my knee. Okay, we're just gonna go through some of the operating features of the machine. First of all, I'm gonna power the machine on now that it's plugged in, okay? When you turn your machine on, you're gonna see on the screen that it automatically defaults to a standard stitch 1 and then a 2.5 stitch length. So if your instructions for a project ever don't give you any kind of instruction on like what stitch length or what stitch to use, you would just assume that it is going to be the default, which is 1 stitch selector, 2.5 stitch length, okay? So I'm just gonna go through, this is in, corresponds with your note card that you will fill in all the machine parts. So the very first part is the hand wheel. The hand wheel is right over here, it's on the right side of your machine. This is used to raise and lower the needle. And to use it, I'm just gonna turn it toward me. So notice how my thumb is turning in this direction toward me, okay? And that is the hand wheel, and I'll show you what happens with that. So as I am turning the hand wheel, it is going to raise and lower the needle. It also raises and lowers the thread take-up lever. You see that come up? So there's the thread take-up lever. So it's going to do both of those things. It's raising and lowering the needle and raising and lowering the presser foot. You always want to turn the hand wheel toward you as opposed to away from you. So towards you like this with your thumb, okay? Not back this way, because if I had thread in it and I'm turning it away from me, it would tangle the threads up. So that is number 1. Number 2 on your note card is the stitch selector. That is this dial right here, and that is going to control this number, okay? It will also, when you turn it, it will also change. Sometimes it will change this letter, and then sometimes it will change these numbers as well. But really what the stitch selector is doing, it is going to control which one of these stitches you are using, and you have 50 options here, okay? So in order to change it, I am just going to turn the dial to the right or to the left, and it adjusts the stitch that you're going to be using. There's a few things that you need to know about the stitch selector. So first of all, when I am on 1, I see that there is a J above the 1. You also might notice right above here, there is a little picture of a foot. So what that is telling you is that the J, or whatever letter it is that you see there, corresponds with a presser foot that you're going to be using for that stitch, okay? So for a straight stitch, we've got a 1 or a 2. Both of those are going to use a J foot. Real quick, I also want to show you something on the 1 and the 2. So they're both straight stitches. We'll use both of them quite often. But you look right here. It's a straight stitch, and then there is a dot in an oval, okay? That is showing you the needle position. So when I have a 1, my needle is in the far left position, and this is going to control your seam allowance, okay? So you need to pay attention to where the position of your needle is. So over to the left is a 1. If I want to center my needle, I can put it on a 2. So that's just kind of something to keep an eye out for. But back up here to the screen, so I see my stitch that I'm on, I see what presser foot I need, I see how many needles I need. This always in the basic sewing classes should have a 1 needle. If I accidentally bump that and there's 2, then when you start sewing later, it will come up with an E8 message. E8 is an error code, and it is going to cause some problems with your machine. So if you ever have an E8 show up and you notice there's 2 needles there, just hit the button, okay, and make it back to 1 needle, okay? The reason that you would want to pay any attention at all to the letter right there on the screen is when you have a certain foot on your machine and you turn to a different stitch, it's possible that the stitch is going to move the needle maybe from side to side or in various patterns. And when you have the needle moving in certain directions, it could end up hitting the presser foot and breaking the needle. So that's why you want to use the certain foot that is designed for that certain stitch, okay? We're ready to move on now to number 3 on your note sheet. Number 3 is the stitch length. So I'm going to zoom in here. You can kind of see on the top of the machine right here, it shows you how the stitch is small and then the stitch is getting larger, okay? That is the stitch length. So you would change the stitch length, of course, if your directions tell you to, but if you ever need to do a based stitch, a based is a really long stitch, something that is going to be really loose. It may be temporary and something that you're going to be ripping out later. Or sometimes you use a really long stitch if you are gathering up and make something ruffled so that your fabric can slide along on your thread. So if I needed a longer stitch length than a standard, so this is 2.5 standard, I'm going to hit the plus button. If I'm doing a baste, I want to do it all the way up to a 5. And usually if you're basting, you don't have to reverse or do a back stitch of any sort because you want to keep it loose. You want to have it temporary where it can be ripped out later, okay? Let's say you're making something really small that needs a lot of detailing, then you would lower the stitch length to a smaller size. Sometimes quilters will use a 2.0 because they may not back stitch at the ends of their rows, and so having just a slightly smaller stitch length than standard is helpful. That way, if they are pulling on their pieces to try to fit them together, they don't come completely undone. So they want to have a relatively small stitch length. Now number 4 on your guide is the stitch width. So if you look below here, it has this zigzag pattern and it keeps getting wider and wider. That number is going to be the bottom number right here. So I'm actually going to turn the stitch selector to a 5. So it still says J foot. Then it's adjusted the standards over here. It's got a 1.4 stitch length and a 3.5 stitch width. You would want to look on your pattern directions to determine how wide the stitch would need to be. But if you needed a more narrow, smaller zigzag, or you needed a wider one, you would adjust the width of it. That's how wide the zigzag, so basically how far back and forth the needle is going to be going each time. It also has a length, so you can increase like the height of each stitch by also using that plus or the minus for the stitch length. Okay, so that's number 5. Number 4. Number 5 on your diagram is the bobbin winder. Bobbin winder is only used when you are winding a bobbin. And you need to wind a bobbin in sewing so that you can have thread underneath the machine that is going to loop with your top thread. And we'll watch a video that kind of shows what that looks like. But just to show you, this is the bobbin winder. And one thing I like to have you try is before doing anything with the bobbin winder, I'm going to zoom out here. I am going to have you lower your presser foot. We haven't looked at the presser foot yet, but if you reach through here, there's a gray lever. Just lower that down, okay? And then I'm gonna have you put your foot on the foot pedal. We've not done this yet either, but I want you to see what happens to your needle as you put your foot on the foot pedal. It's gonna raise it and lower it. I'm actually gonna turn that down a bit. So it's gonna raise and lower my needle, just goes up and down, okay? That is what happens most of the time when you're using your machine. However, when you are winding your bobbin, you're going to have your bobbin on here, and we'll learn how to do this in class. You'll follow those guidelines, but you will engage the bobbin. To engage the bobbin, you are going to push this over to the right, and it slides up right next to this metal sensor, okay? Now what happens if I put my foot on the foot pedal, this spins, but my needle no longer moves. And so the reason you need to know this is because sometimes you'll come into class and someone else who has recently used the machine will have wound a bobbin, and they will have left it like this for some reason, or they will just do it that way to be obnoxious. And then you will think your machine is broken because the needle's not moving. So you need to just look up there and see, is the bobbin winder engaged? To disengage it, you just push it back over to the left. Right, number 6 on your card is the spool pin. And so what that is that's this right here. And it is gonna be like right on top of your machine. Okay, you kind of slide it up a little bit to see it better. It's also got a spool pin cover, and you always wanna keep your cover with your machine. Do not put that in your tray ever, okay? It's never okay to take that and put it in your tray. So what the spool pin does is, I've got a spool of thread here. You're gonna want the spool, the thread coming off the front of the spool. I'm gonna slide it on to the spool pin, and then I'm going to put the cover back on, okay? And the cover needs to fit the size of the spool. So this is pretty close in the same size. You don't want one that's really huge or really tiny. But what that does is it just keeps the spool from sliding off the end of the spool as you're sewing, okay? So that is the spool pin right here. This is the spool pin cover. Always make sure to keep this on the spool pin. I'm gonna pull it off. I'm gonna take the spool off, and then when you store your machine each day, that's where it needs to go, just right there. I won't go into too much detail on number 7 right now. 7 are the thread guides. You have tons of thread guides on your machine. And they're all used to properly thread the machine to make sure that it operates the best that it can. So just really kind of showing you where they're at, and we'll learn how to use them when we thread the machine. This is a thread guide. This is a thread guide. Those are both thread guides that you used in winding a bobbin and in threading the machine. This is a thread guide used for bobbin winding only. And the way you can tell the difference is on the top of the machine, there is a dotted line for bobbin winding and a solid line for machine threading. I'm gonna look at this little path. That is another part of my thread guide, and that's part of the thread guide. So all of it is a path or a guide that your thread will take whenever you're doing different procedures. So when you're threading your machine or you're winding your bobbin, you'll follow those different thread guides. It's very important to properly thread the machine. If it's done in the wrong way, your machine will not work correctly, and it will be frustrating for you. You'll have to redo things, and it's just not ideal. So just always follow the path that you are supposed to for whatever procedure you're doing. Okay, number 8 is your thread take-up lever. There's a couple ways to access your thread take-up lever, but whenever you're threading your machine, you want your thread take-up lever in the highest position. First of all, to show you where it is, it's right in between. So here's my 4, and the little curve goes around arrow. There's an opening that's a little bit wider. The thread take-up lever can be visible from in there, and one way to access it is just to hit my needle up-down button. So there, it popped it up all the way to the top. That's exactly where I want it when I'm threading my machine. So if you end sewing, let's say you're finished sewing a row, and for whatever reason your needle is still down, usually that's not how it's supposed to be. You'd want your needle to be all the way up and your thread take-up lever at the highest position. But if for some reason your needle is down and you're trying to thread your machine, you could just hit the needle up button, pops that thread take-up lever up high. Or you could also turn your hand wheel toward you until the thread take-up lever is in the highest position. And it corresponds with the needle. So when the thread take-up lever is up, your needle is also up. There is a eye, it's like a circular eye at the very tip of the thread take-up lever. It's like on the inside, and the thread will go through that when we're threading the machine. You'll see that in a future lesson. Right, number 9 on your card is tension control. It is turned to a 4 right now, and that's pretty much where you will leave it always. There are a couple of projects that you might do in other classes. Maybe you might have to deal with a gathering stitch that is done on the machine, in which case we would really increase the tension where it's a really tight lower thread, and it helps to gather up the fabric. But most of the time when we are sewing, we're going to be right here at a 4. That is standard for this machine. If you notice that your stitching just is not looking right, if something's just really off with it, or if your threads are breaking while you're sewing, you might take a peek at that dial and make sure that someone hadn't moved it to a higher number. They shouldn't, but if they had, or if someone had been working on another project and left it at a 9, it will definitely influence how your project is turning out. So look at that and know that it should always be on a 4. All right, number 10, we've already looked at this, but this is our needle up-down button. So really the only thing I need to tell you about the needle up-down button is that it's all or nothing. It's either all the way up or all the way down. So now my needle's all the way up. Now my needle's all the way down. Okay, so that's great when I'm just sewing or anything, pretty much any time it's gonna work. Unless, let's say I just need to move my needle just slightly, maybe I need to make room to shift some fabric around, in which case I would want to use the hand wheel and turn it toward me, because in that example I can just turn it just a tiny little bit. I don't have to raise it all the way or lower it all the way. Number 11 is the reverse. It looks like a little U-turn right here, okay? And so you're going to use the reverse button most of the time when you are beginning and ending a seam. If your directions say backstitch at start and stop, that's what it means. It means reverse. Use that reverse button. So you might see reverse, you might see backstitch, but it's talking about this button right there. And a reverse or a backstitch is used at the beginning and ending of a seam as security. It just keeps the threads from coming undone. Basically, it is like tying a knot at the end of each seam so that the threads don't come loose. There are times when you don't want to backstitch. So earlier on the based stitch, I was talking about something being temporary or something being used for gathering. In those situations, you would not want to reverse, because that would be more of a permanent thing if you're backstitching or reinforcing the ends. So if it's something that's temporary, you may not end up reversing. Or if in your instructions it says do not backstitch, do not reverse, then you would avoid doing that. Otherwise, we just sort of assume in here that you're always going to backstitch on a straight stitch. If you're using a decorative stitch or a zigzag, it really is okay to just not use the reverse function. So number 12 is your machine needle. Right now it's down underneath the throat plate. I'm gonna raise the needle so you can see it. And this machine is actually on a zigzag. I don't know if you could see how the needle jumped. I'm gonna do that again so you can see it. It kind of popped over it jumped over to the right there, down, jumped over to the left. That's because it's in a zigzag. If we had this on a 1, it's just going to go up and down. Okay, but the needle is stored right inside of where it says number 6. That's the 6th position for threading. And the needle is going to come out from there. And then next to the needle, there is a black screw. If your needle ever gets bent or broken and you need to replace it, and you can grab a penny to stick it inside, there's a little groove in there to pop that loose. The needle will come out. You'll go over to the machine needles box. This is probably over on the sewing cart. But you're gonna wanna look for a universal needle, okay? So then you would just replace it. All of the needles I have in here are universal, except the ones in the orange packs. These are our double needles, and you will not ever need to use those, okay? So any of the needles in there are fine. Needles for machines are different than needles for hand sewing. So for this, the eye of the needle is down at the very bottom here, whereas a hand sewing needle, the eye of the needle would be at the top and the point would be at the opposite end. You want to change your needle rather frequently, especially if it starts getting bent or you're having any issues with your stitching. Just look at the needle and see if it is curved or if it has any dings in it, and it can kind of get damaged and then not work as well. But always do be careful when you're sewing. You don't want to run over any pins. You don't want to run over the metallic or the metal parts of any zippers, because those can bend or break your needle. Okay. Number 13 is your presser foot. As we talked about earlier, depending on what stitch you're doing, you might have different presser feet. This is the J foot. It's the standard one. It's nice because it has this opening, this little slit right here, so you can use that when you're top stitching to line up the edge of your fabric. It's also nice because it has this clear face to it where you can see through it, okay? I'm going to raise my presser foot using the gray lever back here. So I've raised my presser foot, and then around back behind the presser foot, there's a little black button. I'm just gonna push that and it drops your presser foot. So whenever you're changing out your presser feet, you just hit that little button. You find out whichever presser foot you need, and I'm just gonna put the same one back on. But when you're looking at your foot, there is a metal bar right down the center, okay? So you're gonna find that metal bar and you're gonna line it up with what I call the Lego hand. It is right, let's see here, right there, okay? And I call it a Lego hand because it goes like that, okay? So you'll grab the bar in that spot. And I'm gonna struggle because I'm holding the camera. Okay, what I'm gonna do, so you could just pop it up there if you had control with your hands, but I'm gonna try to just lower my foot and pop it in. Let's see if I can do that now. There we go. So it just grabs it, and then now your foot is attached again. So your presser foot lifter, you just reach through the arm. Here's the arm of the machine. This is the throat of the machine. You're gonna reach through here, raise and lower the presser foot, okay? So this is my right hand just reaching back there to do that. You'll use that a million times a day if you're sewing. It's a very used part of the machine because you need it every time you start and end a seam, or you're moving, or I mean, if you're pivoting, you're using that. It's used all the time. Number 14 is the throat plate. So this whole thing is the throat of the machine. The throat plate is this metal portion right here, and you'll notice that there are numbers and boxes, and that is going to be an indicator for you of what seam allowance that you are going to be working with, okay? So we'll talk more about that when we learn how to start sewing, but just understand that this is the throat plate. There's a couple things I can do with that. Like if you ever have issues with your machine, I can open up the front of your machine. I can slide this off, okay? And then I can look back in there. Look how dusty this machine is. I need to clean it, okay? These get serviced twice a year, but then in between that, kids use them all the time. And when they don't have any issues, I don't get in there and clean them. but like this one definitely needs cleaned. I'll have to do that. But anyway, if you're having problems, then I'm able to access, open it up, check it out, see if there's any issues. I can lift this out and see, like, look how much dust and dirt there is down in there. That is just terrible. We need to clean that. But I can pop that back in place, slide this back on. And all of this is easy to do as long as that drawer is open. So this little drawer in front had to have been open, and then when I close it, now everything's secure again. Okay, so that is just talking about number 15, the throat plate. That's really the metal part with the grid lines. So number 15 are the feed dogs, and we can look at them on your machine in a second, but they are these little teeth that are underneath the presser feet. And basically what they're doing is your presser foot is gonna close down, so that we have to have a lowered presser foot on the fabric. The fabric would be right here. Presser foot down, and then the throat plate is gonna be a solid surface. Then I have these feed dogs. They've got the teeth on them, and as you operate your machine, it's going to move the fabric. They're gonna go like this. So let's say I want to reverse and hit the back, my feed dogs are gonna change directions. That's how the movement happens. So the feed dogs are the teeth underneath the throat plate that move the fabric through. Number 17 is the bobbin case. That's actually the area underneath the bobbin cover. So this area down here is your bobbin case, and it's used to hold the bobbin while sewing. This is a drop-in bobbin, which is amazing. We have really simple machines to use. These have gotten so easy over the years. Because if you have a machine at home, you might have a separate like metal piece that your bobbin fits into. It might fit in like facing this way instead of dropping down. But anyway, these are a drop-in bobbin, and this is the bobbin case. And when we start learning about threading the machine, I'll show you how to properly put the bobbin in and how to make sure that everything is in there the right way. But that's the case. This is the bobbin cover, okay? So there's a little slide over here. I'm gonna try to keep my hand out of the way. But you slide that over to the right, okay? And then the bobbin cover just pops right off. So I would take that off, set it aside while I put my bobbin in. Please do not ever put this in your storage tray because we need these on the machines, okay? These should always, as you take it off, you put your bobbin in, you pop it right back on, okay? So that was number 17 was the bobbin cover. Number 18 is the bobbin thread cutter. So I will have put my bobbin in underneath the cover, put the cover back on. Well, we'll see the process in a second. But then I'm gonna go through this path, and at the end there is a blade. And so you can see it really well in the picture on the screen, but this is a blade that will cut the thread. It's a really handy little tool, and also just an easy feature that these machines have that a lot of newer machines do have is to automatically cut that bobbin thread for you when starting out. Number 19 is your speed control. So some of you are probably speedy speeders when you're out driving around. You want to speed and go super fast. And some of you will try to be super speedy when you are in here. But this is your speed control. I've got it on a 1 right now. Now there is a time when I do want you to turn it up. Whenever we're bobbin winding, you could have your machine all the way to a 3, but most of the time you'll stay at a 1 or a 2 until you get really good. Those of you who have had some experience before, and you really do just need to feel confident and comfortable in your ability before going all the way up to a 3. I sew at a 3 almost always, but I have been sewing for a lot longer, especially if I'm sewing something straight that's really long. It takes a long time. It's just quicker to do it that way. But for you all in class, I would recommend starting at a 1. In fact, some of the exercises I will make you do at a 1, and then I would also recommend you staying around a 2. You also have some control of the speed using your foot pedal. So you can raise or lower your foot to give it more or less pressure, and that will also increase and decrease the speed. All right, so we have already looked at the machine parts, but now I've got a couple things I want to show you. First of all, over here, this is the big metal cabinet that all of our stuff is stored on. The bottom 2 shelves are for sewing supplies only. Down there, you have those fabric sewing shears. They have a fabric piece hanging on the handle. That's the only thing you should ever cut with those is fabric. The thread, the extra pin cushions, you've got seam rippers, seam gauges, extra bobbins, fabric marking pins, loop turners, your zipper feet are stored there, hand and embroidery needles, and the machine sewing needles are all stored on these bottom 2 shelves. The upper shelves are for classroom supplies. So let's say at the end of class you are cleaning up. Because you are on cleanup duty, please make sure any sewing items go to the bottom shelves, the last 2 shelves closest to the floor, okay? And then we designate the top 3 shelves for more just like general classroom supplies, paper, scissors, markers, colored pencils, that type of stuff. Also on that same cart, we have this Clorox container. It's covered in paper. What this is for, there's an opening at the top. This is for any sharp objects. So if you have a pen that is bent, so it's no good anymore, but it's still sharp, you would drop it down in there. If you break your sewing machine needle and you have to replace it with a new one, you'll put the pointy end of the old needle down into that opening at the top. And anything else that is sharp, if you ever break something that would have a jagged or a sharp edge, you'll want to put it in that. That is just keeping anyone who might be working in maintenance or like janitorial staff, if they are working with the trash, they don't want to accidentally get cut by something that you've thrown away in the trash can. So anything sharp should go into that container. We're going to look at cleanup procedures next. So I want to make sure that I power off my machine. Always power it off. I want to make sure that I don't have my spool, that I don't have my bobbin in. And what I do want to do is I want to get into the drawer, and there should be a little piece of fabric that's not stitched on. I'm going to slide it underneath the presser foot. I'm going to lower my needle, lower my presser foot. So I've got fabric stored in there with the needle down. I'm going to unplug my machine. I'm going to do this from the outlet. So I am not going to just grab the cord up here and yank. I am not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to take the extra 2 seconds it takes to reach down and grab a hold of the plug and pull from there. That is for the longevity of these cords. It will stay nicer, longer if we take care of them, okay? So next I'm going to take my foot pedal and the cord. You may not be able to see this the whole time because I'm out of the view, but I'm just going to smooth the cords out so they're even and straight. And then I'm going to just start wrapping around the foot pedal. Okay, so I'm going to wrap. And then I'm going to stick them inside of the arm of the machine. Okay, so there's no cords hanging out or falling out. Then I'm going to go back here to my chair and I'm going to grab the cover. Remember, I want to look at the cover to see where the wide and narrow rectangles are. The wide rectangle is going to go in front of the handle and the narrow rectangle is going to go behind it. Okay, so there's the wide rectangle. I'm going to pick up my machine by the handle. So I'm going to put my right hand in the handle and then I'm going to put my left hand under the machine and I'm going to carry it back to the correct spot.